E-barbs. Hate them or despise them? E-barbs are definitely one of the most popular and polarizing cards in Clash Royale, and this video is all about them. In this video, we'll go over the basics, then talk about a variety of topics, including discussing a bit about their noob stomping, usage, counters, and a little bit about their devious past, and of course, much more. As always, make sure to subscribe if you want to keep up with these PowerPoints and do other stuff that helps out, like liking and hyping the video, which is now a thing, I guess. Also, make sure to join our Discord server and become a member if you have disposable income and want some cool perks. With the ads out of the way, let's get into the video. Let's start out with the basics. The barbs are pretty interesting in that they are two units, being two barbarians that have used steroids and obtained drip. They have an elixir cost of 6, not 7, have a fast speed of 90, with a health of nearly 2000, damage of 558 per hit, with a DPS of 398. These guys also can't attack air units. With the basics out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about these guys. E-barbs are quite interesting actually. When you think of someone who has a high DPS and a bit tanky, you think of a solo card. Cards like Mini P.E.K.K.A, Mega Knight, P.E.K.K.A, Lumberjack, and Prince have one big thing in common. There's only one of them. E-barbs have two of them. So what exactly does this mean? Well, a few things. First off, and probably the most important but underrated part of this, being able to split them to two different lanes. If there's one weakness with the cards I mentioned last slide, they are limited to one lane only, so you have to concentrate resources mainly on one lane most of the time. However, you can build two separate pushes on each lane with E-barbs, which can be devastating with certain combos, especially 3 musketeers, which I'll talk about more later. Of course, having two different guys is quite good in other ways, with extra health, which is important for tanky, high DPS cards, as well as faster hitting speed. Also, they can deal with swarm threats a little better, though of course, cards like Skelly Army will still counter them. Finally, against cards that have damage ramping, these guys are much better than your traditional tanks. Speaking of tanks, let's talk about Noob stomping and his similarities and differences to Mega Knight. As we all know, E-barbs are one of the most notorious of the many mid-ladder menaces. But just like Mega Knight, who I made a PowerPoint on 2 weeks ago, which you should definitely check out, their play rates and usability get absolutely cooked at top ladder, with only 6 out of the top 720 players in ladder playing him. So why is this? Well, it's similar to Mega Knight. These guys seem like very powerful and intimidating threats, and therefore you need to have knowledge of the game to be able to properly defend against them. I don't want to rehash the same spiel about noob stomping again, which I already did with Mega Knight, so I'll try to make this quick. Fast speed, high DPS, and very high health are a difficult combo to face off against for mid-ladder players, but combine that with the fact that there are two of them, and it becomes really difficult. Like I mentioned earlier, the whole splitting lane thing is lethal in mid-ladder, because it forces the opponent to properly allocate resources to defending each side. And most of the time, they either focus on just one lane or over-defend both lanes, going into an elixir deficit. Add combos like E-barbs and Rage, and others that I'll go over, and you can easily see why he's so good in mid-ladder. Another big reason is of course, overleveling. Unlike Mega Knight, who is a legendary card, E-barb is quite common because, well, they're common rarity. Because of this, it's much easier to actually level these guys up than a lot of other cards, which makes them in turn much more annoying to face off against in mid-ladder, where your cards are likely lower leveled than your opponent's E-barbs. Before I talk about their counters and why they aren't good anymore at a higher level, let me do a quick comparison between them and Mega Knight. both cards that seem similar in concept, though maybe not in gameplay. For some similarities, they are both extremely feared and hated in mid-ladder, basically being the best examples of noob stompers. However, there are a few differences, mainly the lack of splash, but E-Barbs are more of an offensive card than Mega Knight. Usually, Mega Knight is best for defense and maybe counter pushing, but while E-Barbs are great at counter pushing, they definitely have much more offensive use, especially with their fast speed, though it did used to be much more in the old days. Another big difference is that E-Barbs have more of an emphasis on fast damage, while Mega Knight is much more focused on being tanky and survival. Now let's talk about some of E-Barb's counters. This is also quite similar to the Mega Knight, but also a few differences. E-Barbs, just like Mini P.E.K.K.A, are very susceptible to Swarm, which is why E-Barbs are often paired with something like Arrows, Log, or Zap. Of course, their biggest counter is, quite ironically, the Mega Knight, who is tanky enough to deal with both of them, while also dealing splash damage to take them both out. This is also why Valk is a solid counter to them as well. Of course, just like Mega Knight, air cards are very good against them, and a great counter is Minion Horde. But all air cards are solid against these guys. As for a cheap but little more complicated way to face off against them, once again, just like the Mega Knight, is to use a mini tank and some other air or long range card. One example could be Knight and Bats, which cleans up the E-Barbs quite nicely and counters against a potential log. Of course, like the Mega Knight, these guys can also be kited and dealt with that way as well. Now let's talk about some of the interesting synergies that the E-Barbs have. First off, tanky win conditions. These are guys like Golem, E-Golem, Royal Giant, E-Giant, and Goblin Giant. But why is this? Well, it's a benefit to both of these guys. For E-Barbs, they get a nice distraction, especially if your opponent plays something like Mega Knight, while also getting most of the damage tanked up by the tanky win condition, letting the E-Barbs cook up. Meanwhile, the tank gets to have extra support from a very powerful card that can help especially against tower cards like Inferno Tower that would usually counter them. Secondly, and a little bit more interesting, is with 3 musketeers. These guys are remarkably similar when you think about it, both being extremely powerful cards that have multiple troops, with E-Barbs having 2 and 3 musks having, well, you know. By themselves, 1 E-Barb and 1 musk is still a powerful threat, so combining them, very, very powerful indeed. Splitting the 3 musks and then putting the E-Barb on the lane of the single musk will force your enemy to make very tough decisions, as both sides will be very difficult to defend even on their own, let alone together. Of course, there's one small limitation to this, and well, you guessed it. This combo costs a whopping 15 elixir to pull off, which is why elixir collectors also usually use along these sides. Also, because of this, usually this deck is one of those decks that are weak as the game starts, but as more time goes on, becomes better. This is why if you manage to bring the game to a sudden death, this combo becomes even more lethal with a 3 times elixir boost. And speaking of combos, let's go back in time and talk about peak E-Barbs for a little bit, and by extension, Rage. Peak E-Bars were quite the sight to behold back in early 2017 and late 2016. Why? Well, you could watch the whole history on some other videos, but there was a few reasons for why they were so peak at this time. They actually started off pretty bad on release, but they received a huge buff, including a health buff, a damage buff, an attack time buff, which made them all into mid-ladder menaces. Combine this with the very fast movement speed they used to have, and you have a card that could rip the tower to shreds faster than touching grass, knocking out Clash players. Add Old Rage into the mix, and you have an insanely fast card that deals unfair damage with unfair DPS. Because of all this, you could definitely make a big argument that, at this point of time, elite barbs were a win condition. I mean, when you place them down, you usually weren't counter pushing like you would nowadays. You were doing it for a single purpose, at a single place. Take down the tower, placed at the bridge. The sheer speed that these guys had was also a huge reason for their win condition classification, especially with rage thrown into the mix. A good comparison would be to the Hog Rider, with the focus on speed and quick damage. Of course, they got nerfed later, and E-Barbs have more history which I won't be going over. Let's talk about present day instead. With a nerf to their attack speed and a rework to rage, E-Barbs rage at the bridge is no longer as viable of a strategy. Meaning, E-Barbs is no longer a win condition, and just like Mega Knight, is best in combo with actual win conditions, or as a counter pusher. However, overall, E-Barbs are really starting to struggle. I already mentioned that barely anyone uses them in top ladder, but even in mid ladder, E-Barbs usage rates are going down. Why is this? Well, there's a lot of counters to these guys nowadays, and these guys haven't received a single balance change to help them out in 4 years. But there is an even bigger problem: the lack of an evolution. With new cards getting evos left and right, a lot of cards without evos are getting power creeped. And this is especially true for a card that hasn't gotten a single balance change in 4 years. Even in mid ladder, this guy just can't compete against evos, and has been reduced to niche usage, which is quite the fall off from the best card in the game at one point. Overall, E-Barbs has the reputation of one of the most feared cards in Clash Royale, and at one point in time, they were. However, nowadays, other than a few niches and combos, these guys have fallen quite far, with loads of counters, nerfs, and a lack of an evo, leading to these guys to see basically no use in top play and declining play rates even in mid ladder. With that being said though, always watch out for the not sneaky E-Barbs at the bridge when you have 0 elixir. A huge thank you to NewGlance for helping me out at this video, and as always, thanks for watching. Watch this video, or this playlist, or join the Discord server.